I had a teaser for this entry at the end of my Jungle Book video where I poked fun at Edgar, saying no one really cared for him. Since then, I've had several vocal Edgar defenders in the comments, and upon rewatching the movie, I will admit I was wrong. At least, I was mostly wrong. It's true that there's actually a lot to like about Edgar, but where he fails is at being a villain. But the Edgar fans are right. He deserves his due just like everyone else. So in this video, we're primarily going to explore what worked and what didn't when it came to this hapless butler. We are now firmly in the post-Walt Disney era. The Pooh video I did had some overlap. Although Walt never oversaw the Heffalumps and Woozles that the video focused on, he was around for the first Winnie the Pooh short. To some extent, he was around for the early stages of our next movie, the Aristocats. This movie, which was released in 1970, feels like the company was retreading moments from their previous hits. The plot feels like a mishmash of Lady and the Tramp and 101 Dalmatians. It's a very upbeat, lightweight movie, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is important to keep that in mind when discussing the villain. Edgar the Butler is just as lightweight as this movie, although, as we'll see, this was not always the case. For that, we'll need to dig into the movie's production. For such a breezy film, The Aristocats actually has a pretty lengthy history. There are a lot of details that simply aren't available, and many of the sources I found are from secondhand interviews or animation auction sites. Disney, for whatever reason, doesn't seem too interested in making the movie's full production public. The story was proposed to Walt in 1962, based on a children's book about cats trying to find a home in New York. I haven't been able to track down what the book was, but it was merely the jumping-off point. The setting was changed to Paris, and the original idea was to do it as a live-action, two-part TV special. A butler and a maid find out that they will inherit their rich employer's money when she dies. But the hitch is, she's leaving her money to her cats first, and her servants second. They would have then tried to kill or rid themselves of the cats, only for the mother cat to continuously outwit them. For example, one scene would have had the servants digging a hole in the cellar to bury the cats. The mother cat would shut the door on them, locking them in. Meanwhile, they would hit a water main and find themselves trapped in the flooding basement. Also, throughout the story, the mother cat would be trying to find homes suited for her kitten's unique talents. Walt felt that the material with the kittens finding homes was the strongest aspect of the script, and suggested that it be an animated feature. By the time production was truly underway, Walt was dead, and many of the ideas he liked were dialed back or cut. The relationship between the servants went through a few stages, as did their names. Originally, the butler was named Pierre, and the maid was Suzette. A script fragment from 1968 shows the two having separate soliloquies where they would pine for each other, but doubt the other one feels the same way. This is in line with the original pitch, where they would be in cahoots with each other to try to kill the cats and gain the fortune. This is also supported by some concept art, presumably from around the same time, which shows them laughing behind their employer's back. As the film developed, the characters' names and relationship changed. The butler became Edgar, and the maid became Elvira. One of the bonus features from the Aristocats shows an entirely different opening, featuring what I believe to be is the most effective version of Edgar as a villain. This story had Elvira coming across as a lovable airhead, absolutely smitten with Edgar. Edgar is drawn as a bit more handsome, and just a tad bit more sinister. He grumbles to himself about having to serve the spoiled cats, planting the seeds in our head that he's already resentful of his position. Edgar would overhear the madam saying that he and Elvira would inherit her fortune. He's excited until he realizes he'll have to share the money with Elvira. Taking advantage of the maid's affections, Edgar would launch into a love song called How Much You Mean to Me. If he marries her, he'll get all the money.
Do you know how very, very much you mean to me? Do you know how rich, how very, very rich our lives could be?
Only after he's proposed to Elvira does Edgar hear the rest of Madame's will, and learns that the cats will inherit the money first. If you look closely at the storyboards, the ones featuring a shorter, dumbier Edgar, you'll see that the characters' names were still Pierre and Suzette when the song was first written. This Edgar does elicit a bit of sympathy at first. It must be rather undignified to be a servant for a bunch of cats. But when he uses Elvira as a tool for riches, he becomes reprehensible. I wish they had kept this version of the character, who we'll see was essentially neutered in the final movie. This is all we know of Elvira's character, by the way. If I had to speculate, I'd imagine that this version of Elvira would initially work with Edgar to get rid of the cats, only to change her mind at the end. She's being manipulated here, and she seems far too naive to really do anything out of malice. You can practically hear someone like Ellen Greene doing the voice.
Rule number 1, never marry in haste.
Ultimately, Elvira was dropped from the plot. Reportedly, they had Elsa Lanchester in mind for her, and Boris Karloff in mind for Edgar. The two had memorably appeared in The Bride of Frankenstein as the titular bride and the monster, so it would have been fun to have them together again. Speaking of horror, one other idea for Edgar seemed to have roots in Jekyll and Hyde. In the alternate opening, Madame's lawyer warns her that Edgar and Elvira must not know about the will, because greed can corrupt an otherwise good person. This is followed up by a shot of an absolutely devilish Edgar, instantly consumed by greed. A script fragment I found, when he was still called Pierre, took this even further. The butler was to have talked to his reflection, which would represent his evil side, or his practical side, as it called itself. This whole split personality business gave Edgar a dimension that we don't get to see in the final movie. I assume it was cut because this isn't a movie about a good man being corrupted. First and foremost, it's a movie about a bunch of cats wandering through Paris. But enough about the film's development, let's talk about the Aristocats as it was seen in 1970, and its long-suffering butler. When we meet Edgar, he seems like a remarkably patient fellow. Right off the bat, we see him put up with Toulouse climbing up his face while he's driving. If he does have any resentment toward the cats, it doesn't show, unlike in the alternate opening where his mask slips a little. While his employer, Madame Adelaide Bonfamille, truly is a kind person, it doesn't mean that Edgar's job is necessarily an easy one. He's clearly a hard worker, and the crafty kittens are most likely a handful. It really does seem that Edgar cares about the Madame and her cats, at least as much as a butler can. Aside from the cats, he's the closest thing Madame has to a family, and she seems to appreciate it. Her leaving her fortune to her cats amounts to a mix of being sentimental and eccentric. Is it a bit much? Most definitely, but it's coming from a good place. I think the biggest missed opportunity with Edgar comes in how they handled the scene where he learns about Madame's will. In the earlier draft, we see him instantly get consumed by greed, making a devious face not unlike the coachman in Pinocchio. You know the face. His first move, before hearing about the cats, is to seduce Elvira so he'll have access to even more money. Couple that with George's line about how greed can corrupt a good man, and the split personality idea, and you have a wonderfully scummy villain to root against. Not only that, but him finding out about the cats after proposing to Elvira almost feels like an act of karma. In the final film, Edgar's reaction is less slimy. He blows a kiss to Madame and does a little dance of joy. Yes, it's still out of greed, but don't tell me you wouldn't react with some excitement to that kind of news. Given everything we know about Adelaide, Edgar really has earned this inheritance, and the news about the cats rightfully stings. After all, what can cats even do with money? That's where it gets a little hazy. I hear people point out that as the cat's butler, Edgar would still technically be in control of most of their fortune. He's a human. That would make sense, but the problem in the Aristocats is that they never quite make it clear how animals and humans coexist. In Lady and the Tramp, the pets are just pets. Animals act like animals for the most part. In the Aristocats, although the titular cats are still pets, we also have cats that walk on two legs and play musical instruments. They're anthropomorphic enough that, hey, maybe these cats can actually control their finances if need be. Am I overthinking this? Yes, but that's what I'm here for. Edgar does lose a few sympathy points when he frets about the cats having 9 lives, meaning that they may outlive him. That's a dunderheaded idea. However, assuming that Adelaide dies within a few years, 3 of these cats are still kittens, meaning that Edgar may have to wait up to 15 years to get his money. And if any of those cats have kittens, would he have to wait longer?
Cats inherit first, and I come after the cats. Me after... No, it's not fair. Oh.
It really is an unfair situation. There's a difference between a stipulation that the cats must be well taken care of versus the cats actually inheriting the money. Well, I'm certainly not one to advocate for hurting an animal. It's hard to truly hate Edgar for wanting to get rid of those cats. You could argue that this ties into the idea in the early scripts of greed corrupting a good man, but I feel they don't really lean into this as much as they could have. We do have some hints of a darker side to Edgar as the film goes on. Obviously, he drugs and abandons the cats. It's unclear if he meant to kill them before getting waylaid, but given that he thinks they have 9 lives, I don't think he'd see the point in trying. Later, he brags to his horse, Frou-Frou, about his kidnapping making the headline news. The idea that he's so pleased with this crime that he has to tell someone, even if it's just his horse, should count for something. There's not a trace of guilt on his face. Then, just a day or two after he takes the cats, we see Edgar slacking on the job, smoking a cigar, and breaking out the champagne. Please note that Madame is in the other room, deep in depression from losing her pets. At this point, it's gotten harder to pity him. I'll admit it, he's not a saint. But for me at least, that initial moment when he finds out he's being passed over for some cats really solidifies him as being more pitiful than villainous. We can feel sorry for a villain, yes, but Edgar is more of a desperate fool than anything. I mean, he really doesn't plan anything in advance. He hears about the will, and a few moments later, he's already preparing to drug the cats. When he's in a complete panic at the cats returning, he throws them in a crate marked for Timbuktu, probably the first place that came to mind. Had he shipped the cats, there's a good chance they would have suffocated before they reached their destination. But I don't think Edgar even considered that. He was just improvising at that point. And while we don't want to see any of the cats hurt, it's hard for me not to feel a little bad for the butler when he ends up unconscious in the crate himself. So, in the last few minutes, I have not painted the best picture of Edgar. I've really laid into all the things that don't make him work as a villain. But I don't want to be totally negative here. Now it's time to focus on the things that do work. The strongest aspect of Edgar is his animation. The Disney artists did a great job with this character. When he's in butler mode, he's as prim and proper as they come. When he's alone, he's able to really let his feelings out. In these scenes, Edgar wears his heart on his sleeve, rapidly going through a succession of intense emotions. His body language and facial expressions are a joy to behold. His voice actor, Maude-Roxby, is also having a good time hamming it up. I really can't find too many details about Mr. Roxby, but he's apparently had a long career in British comedy. The scene where Edgar is chased by a pair of hound dogs is a lot of fun. The movie's director, Wooly Reitherman, had previously supervised the Peter Pan scenes with Hook and the Crocodile. I don't think anything will ever quite match the comic energy of those chases, but this one comes pretty close. The scene was so popular with test audiences that late into production, a second scene with Edgar and the dogs was added. Sadly, I don't think chase number 2 really lives up to the madcap fun of the first one. I've actually grown to like Edgar more than I did before, but I think part of that is from focusing on him so much when making this video. I find myself growing attached to most villains I cover for this reason. When I focus so closely on these characters, I end up picking up on a lot of details and nuances that could be missed in one viewing. And although I've harped on Edgar in the past for being a poor villain, maybe that's not the worst thing ever. After all, not everyone can be a Maleficent or a Cruella. Not everyone needs to be. The Aristocats is a lightweight movie. It's sugary fluff. That sounds dismissive, but it really does have a gentle charm to it. It's never been my favorite Disney movie, but I can see why other people like it. A character like Edgar fits snugly into this film. Even when he's chasing O'Malley with a pitchfork, he's just not that threatening. I was more worried for O'Malley's safety when he was with those crazy geese. At the same time, the most frustrating parts of Edgar will always stick out to me. In the early drafts, we had a suitably wicked character that we could root against. In the final movie, he seems, to me at least, more sympathetic than he was meant to be. Anyone who's ever worked in the service industry knows how difficult it can get. Adelaide means well, and the Aristocats themselves are sweet. I just can't bring myself to dislike them. But part of me wishes Edgar could have gotten a better deal. But hey, then we wouldn't have a story. Before we move on to Edgar's other appearances, I wanted to mention his last name. I've found a lot of websites, mostly fan wikis, that list him as Edgar Balthazar. I assume this was some name on a model sheet or mentioned in behind-the-scenes feature, so I looked, and looked, and looked, but I can find no evidence of this being his canonical name. I reached out to my viewers as well. I appreciate everyone's help, and I think we can chalk this up to pure fanon. As far as appearances outside his original movie goes, Edgar has not made many. We're actually going to be seeing this in several of the following entries. Characters like Prince John and Madame Medusa are plenty colorful, but their appearances have been surprisingly limited. Believe it or not, Edgar made a theme park appearance. It was only for a special event, but that's something. In 2019, Disneyland Paris had their Disney Loves Jazz event. Over at the Disney Studios park, Edgar appeared in an interactive show. A director filmed a scene from the Aristocats featuring the butler, with guests helping with sound effects. It appeared to be similar to that park's starring Cruella de Vil show. After that, Edgar was able to meet with guests. Given that the Aristocats takes place in Paris, I suppose Disney's French park was the most appropriate place for him. A simplified stage version of the Aristocats is out there, meant to be licensed as a short musical, ideal for children's community theater or school productions. It slightly remedies Edgar's sympathetic qualities by making him a little more openly contemptuous of the cats.
A life of shame, completely de rigueur. I've been reduced to a kitty cat chauffeur. I'm forced to serve these feline spoiled brats. Oh, how I hate the Aristocats!
Edgar's only other post-movie appearances have been in comics, and even those have been rather limited. Marketing has always been an important factor for Disney films, and to tie into the movie, 2 comic book series were released. One focused on O'Malley and the Alley Cats, the other on the Aristocats. They both ran from the early to mid-70s, with the Aristocats comic lasting for 8 issues, and O'Malley's lasting for 9. The placement of Edgar in the comics is inconsistent. For one thing, the comics all run on their own continuities that vary from story to story. This is the same for many Disney comics. For instance, many stories have O'Malley know Duchess and the kittens, but not be living with them. They also seem to have O'Malley know them before the events of the movie, since Edgar is still acting as the Madam's butler. Not that I'm about to make a chart of the Aristocats multiverse here. Disney generally pumped these stories out, assuming kids wouldn't care about the details. In most of these stories, Edgar is just the butler. Presumably, this is before he knows about Madam's will, so he doesn't really have much against the cats. His appearances are sporadic as a result. He often only appears in a panel or two to shoo the mischief-prone kittens out of the house. 2 stories stick out as being truly notable as far as Edgar is concerned. Edgar the Cat Catcher has Duchess and O'Malley on a nightly stroll when they come across a pair of tramps. They recognize one as Edgar, who has returned from Timbuktu. Edgar recognizes them right back and blames them for his current situation. He tries to kill them on the spot with a shovel, but a police officer deters him. Instead, Edgar opts to get his revenge legally. He goes to the mayor with phony statistics, claiming the cats are overrunning the city. With a little trickery, he gets himself elected official cat catcher. This gives him the excuse to capture all the cats he's tangled with in the past. O'Malley gets the last laugh, however. He seeks out the mayor's wife's prized kitten, who agrees to help. The kitten puts himself in one of Edgar's cages, making it seem like the ex-butler captured him as well. The mayor furiously strips Edgar of his job before he can harm any of the cats he's been catching. Edgar's other notable appearance is another follow-up to the movie. In the later issues of O'Malley and the Alley Cats, the characters became increasingly anthropomorphic. They were now much larger, and freely interacted with human characters in contemporary settings. It was downright surreal at times. Edgar appears in one of these. He's a butler for a new rich client, Mrs. Van Ritz, but he still blames the cats for losing fortune. Rather than try to round them up and kill them like in the other story, he just acts passive-aggressive. The first thing he does in the story is trip O'Malley while on a walk. Edgar's new art-loving employer sends out invitations to a party. One of them literally flies into O'Malley's paws, allowing him and his alley cat friends to stroll inside. Needless to say, Edgar is not pleased. As I said, it's quite surreal to see him actually speaking with O'Malley. Yeah, surreal. I don't think there's another word for it. Things get worse when Van Ritz's new statue is stolen. There's been a string of art thefts around town, and the cats are determined to find the criminal. Van Ritz's maid is eventually revealed to be a male thief in disguise. Edgar is forced to begrudgingly serve the cats as reward. Talk about humiliation. And also déjà vu. At the same time, I think this is the best place to leave Edgar. True, it's not exactly a happy ending, nor is it canonical in the slightest, but based on everything we've seen of this character, I think he deserves a bit of mercy. The only other Aristocats villain I can find is an obscure one. You know me, I love my deep dives. A direct-to-video sequel was planned for release in 2008, but got shelved. It was going to be set on a holiday cruise with a jewel thief aboard. 2 animatics have surfaced, one of which shows the thief being caught by the cats. Unfortunately, since we don't have access to most of the movie, the identity of this guy is still largely a mystery. He refers to himself as the captain during the chase, but another story reel shows a different captain. Perhaps the real captain was framed at some point in the story and the thief took over the ship. Again, we can really only speculate. On one more note of speculation, given that this is a story reel, the voices are scratch tracks with no credited actors. However, the villain sounds a good deal like Corey Burton.
Here, kitty kitty, come to Captain.
Coincidentally, Burton has actually voiced Edgar once. Disney released a fully orchestrated professional recording of Edgar and Elvira's song, with Burton doing Edgar's vocals and Kate Higgins as Elvira.
Do you know how much, how very, very much you mean to me? Do you know how rich, how very, very rich our lives could be?
And so, we are wrapping up this entry and shipping it off to Timbuktu. The next Disney movie to feature extensive animation was Bedknobs and Broomsticks in 1971. The true villains in that movie were live action: a seedy bookseller, his slimy enforcer, and, oh yeah, a squadron of Nazis. Being a Disney movie, the Nazis are somewhat sanitized. They're not doing a full-scale invasion of England. In their own words, it's a minor raid to induce panic and to spread a little mischief. Sure. The only one relevant to this video is the animated King Leonidas, ruler of the far-off island of Nabumbu. About midway through the movie, witch-in-training Eglantine Price and her friends journey to the island to see the king. You see, he has a pendant with special magic words engraved on it. Unfortunately for them, the king is incredibly temperamental and doesn't seem all that interested in cooperating with humans, who are banned from his island. The only thing that can bring a smile to his face is a good soccer game, leading one of Price's companions, Amelius Brown, to volunteer as referee. The king's booming voice was provided by Lenny Weinrib, who you've probably heard at least once in your childhood. His other roles include H.R. Pufnstuf, Ronald McDonald's friend Grimace, and the original Scrappy-Doo. His range can even be heard in the movie itself. Weinrib also voices the timid secretary bird. What I'd like to know is why King Leonidas talks like a pirate.
Steady, matey. Move it around.
Leonidas is fun, but he doesn't merit a full video. He's only in a small section of the movie for one thing, and for another thing, he's teetering on the edge between being a villain or just a difficult neutral character. On one hand, he comes across as a loud, brash bully, cheating at soccer and abusing his hapless royal aide. On the other hand, his subjects seem to like him and find his antics on the field entertaining. On one hand, he hates humans and probably wouldn't have been interested in sharing his pendant. On the other hand, they never actually try to ask him. After the game, when they're in his good graces, they could have asked to see it and copied the words onto a piece of paper. Perhaps they thought swiping it was the safer bet. On one hand, Leonidas chases them, probably ready to tear the humans to shreds. On the other hand, they did just steal his treasure. Very recently, a stage adaptation of Bedknobs premiered. As of this video, it's toured in the UK and Ireland, but information is still somewhat scarce outside of some promotional pieces and a plot description. From the sound of things, this show had Leonidas as a much more villainous character. The good guys enter a dancing contest in the sea to receive an audience with the king. Unfortunately for them, and all the fish in the briny, the king actually plans to eat whoever wins the contest. When the humans come to meet him, he declares them to be undesirables and wants to eat them to preserve his island's purity. Based on that description alone, it appears that the musical script wants to draw parallels between Leonidas and the Nazis. Leonidas has appeared from time to time at the Disney theme parks. Generally, it's been as a part of parade units, but he recently met at a special villains event at Disneyland. If nothing else, that means that Disney officially thinks of him as a villain. And speaking of lions, our next video will be about another Lion King. No, not Scar, a different phony king. Next time we'll be looking at Prince John and his crooked cronies from Robin Hood. I just spent 20 minutes talking about the butler from the Aristocats.